Okay, welcome to chapter 15, Reconstruction, and the first week for American history, 1865 to the present. FYI, I made a mistake. I thought this class was going from pre-Columbus to the Civil War, but actually it's from the end of the Civil War to the present. So I've adjusted the syllabus, made those corrections. If you printed off the syllabus before 1 or 2 o'clock on Wednesday, August the 16th, you need to go print it off again because there were errors in there. So I apologize for that. This is the first time that they've had me teaching American history from the Civil War. I'd always taught it before the Civil War, and they changed it. Nobody told me, and I didn't notice till just now. No big deal, because I teach the whole thing in the AP class. I enjoy the latter part just as much as the first part. All right, so here we go. The Civil War is over. What was the Civil War about? Slavery. Slavery, not states' rights, not economics. If they say that, it's about states' rights to own slaves. About economics, because enslaved persons were the most valuable thing in the entire country prior to the Civil War. So the Civil War was fought over slavery and to free the slaves. Now the Civil War is over, and here's how the story is usually told. Civil War is over, the slaves are free, Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, and they lived happily ever after. Wrong, wrong, wrong. And this history is so important because it won't be for another 100 years before the promises that first were put into the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, women we added later, and the idea of equality. No, long way from it. Why? Well, for a little while during the period of Reconstruction, the Civil War is over, the Union Army occupies the South, and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are passed, and you need to know those. 13th Amendment freed the slaves. 14th Amendment, equal protection and citizenship. In the 15th Amendment, the right to vote for formerly enslaved persons. So that was the promise. And until 1877, for 12 years, the Union Army enforced those. But slowly, the white Southerners, who were the ones to commit treason and to rebel against the country, they get back into power, they get back into control. And once they do, and it begins in 1877, the end of Reconstruction, when the white Southerners in the election of 1876 had struck a deal. And the Union Army agreed to leave the South in exchange that the Republican, Rutherford B. Hayes, would be elected president because the president went to the Electoral College. And so Reconstruction, the promise of Reconstruction, that was originally envisioned, in fact, by Abraham Lincoln. Before he died, he got the 13th Amendment passed to free the slaves. So you have this moment in history where it looks like we're going to have Reconstruction, but those things are not going to happen. And I will, we're going to get to that in more detail, but actually let me go ahead and cover it now. How does it happen that this doesn't happen? So for example, the 13th Amendment, it was supposed to free the slaves. All right? The formerly slave owner or human trafficker comes and tells the enslaved person, I guess you're free. They passed the 13th Amendment. War's over. Of course, the enslaved person has deliberately been kept from knowing how to read or write, illiterate. They have no job, no future or anything. If they have a family, they're tied there. They can't really leave. They have nowhere to go. And so the former slave owner, the plantation owner, says, well, you can stay here and work for me. I'll lease you the land. You can be a tenant farmer. You can be my tenant. Because I don't have any money. Oh, that's okay. After you grow your crops, you can give me a share of your crops. Actually, you pay me your crops in exchange for me letting you live where you used to be a slave. And when that's all said and done, then the plantation owner is going to say, well, you know, I lent you some tools, gave you some food because you didn't have anything in February when it got hungry. I sent the doctor because you remember you had some kids that got sick. You got sick for a while. Actually, looks like you didn't make anything this year. And working for no money is called slavery. Now, some might say, I'm out of here. I'm not going to stay and put up with this. You walk down the street, the sheriff picks you up, charges you with vagrancy. Because the 13th Amendment says that slavery nor involuntary servitude shall not exist without due process of law. So you can be put in prison if you violate the law. And so now they violated the law because they're homeless, which is a violation of the law. And then they're put on a chain gang. So literally, they're put back into the chains that they were supposed to be freed from prior to the Civil War, and this is going to go on all the way to the Civil Rights Movement for the next 80 years. Equal protection. Oh, they're equal. They're separate, but equal. Segregation. Jim Crow laws are passed. Because the 14th Amendment was clear. It's got to treat them equally. But the Supreme Court, in 1894, Plessy versus Ferguson, said separate but equal. And so the 14th Amendment fails for another 90 plus years and beyond. But they have the right to vote. Well, I'd have to take a literacy test. I'd have to pay a poll tax. If your grandfather couldn't vote, we don't want people coming down here meddling in our elections, have no business voting here. So your grandfather should have voted, or you don't get to vote. Which, of course, nobody who was a former slave, their grandfathers could vote because they were enslaved persons. So they're deprived of all their rights. And unfortunately, Reconstruction will be a failure. And in some ways, the Civil War is a failure in the promise it had held. Now, there were progress made, there were things made, and you no longer have chattel slavery where property is bought and sold. But the system of suppression and repression and terror will persist. And just in case anybody gets out of line, you have the KKK. And terror would be used for that. This is really important because then the story is retold. And that's the subject, I think, of your assignment, as the lost cause. And so Southerners would say, the Civil War was the glorious cause for the South. States' rights. They had a just cause, but they lost the war. They weren't fighting for slavery or anything like that. They were fighting for moral principles. They were fighting for their freedom. That's what Southerners were fighting for. Never mind that they were fighting to deny the freedom of 4 or 5 million people, and that they had committed treason by going against their Constitution. So then Southerners start naming military bases. They start raising Confederate flags. They start building monuments to the lost cause. And all that is done in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And finally, in 2020, we begin to look at those things and be like, why is Fort Benning, Georgia, where I went to basic training, named for a Confederate general who committed treason? Why do we have a statue of Robert E. Lee who committed treason? And only then, and fought for the cause of the Confederacy, which was to continue enslaving people. So, it's pretty messed up. And that is what you're going to learn about with Reconstruction and a lot more as we go forward. So, that is some of the gist. There's a lot more to it than that, but I tried to cover the overview, the gist of it. And now we're going to move on to industrialization and labor in chapter 16. So best of luck with chapter 15. Email me if you have any questions.